Welcome to the Vanguard Tri-Lakes podcast, where our goal is to help you to walk in a real relationship with Jesus Christ. You're about to hear a sermon from one of our weekend services in Monument, Colorado. We pray that your faith is provoked, your mind is renewed, and your heart is awakened as you engage the Word of God. Stay tuned after the sermon for ways you can stay connected with us. God bless you. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to Vanguard Tri-Lakes. So pumped you're with us today. We are in for a treat today, you guys. The man that's going to speak today, that's going to be leading, is a guy named Thompson. Thomas and I met in 2001, which is a long time ago. You guys weren't born yet, some of you, right? 2001, pre-9/11. And we worked together in a little town called Tyler, Texas, which is in East Texas. We worked at a church called Grace Community Church, and Thomas was hired to be one of the multi-site pastors, and that's where we met. We would hang out early in the mornings some days and play racquetball and lift weights, and you should see Thomas do bench press, because he has this thing where his feet go weird and he struggles to get it up. He's a lot more swole now than he was then. I'm proud of you. You look so much better today than you did when I met you, Thomas. So anyway, Thomas was the pastor here in Colorado Springs, at Pulpit Rock for a long time, and now he owns a company called Thompson Leadership. He actually, for this year of my life as a lead pastor, has been a mentor and a coach. And so if you have liked anything that you've heard from the pulpit here at Vanguard Tri-Lakes, it's his fault. He's a good leader and a good man. Would you give it up for Thomas Thompson this morning?
It's so fun when you know somebody for a long time, because you have so many stories you're thinking of that you're like, I can't tell that. I'm not going to tell that story. I am honored to be here with you guys at Vanguard. I saw somebody with a shirt earlier today that said Vanguard 97, and it reminded me the very first church service I ever attended in Colorado Springs was Vanguard. Kelly Williams was preaching in the basement of a church. I don't even know where it was, but that's where it was. And Kelly and I have been good friends for a long time too. We met back in seminary. And then I was thinking this morning about how windy it was. Wasn't that crazy? You guys, I lost some greenhouses, lost some stuff. It reminded me the very first time I ever preached, I was in college, and we were doing a college mission trip to a little church in St. Louis. And we were there, and so we were doing the service that night. We had worked all day and so we did the service that night, and they were going to let me preach, and they were only going to let me preach for 10 minutes. So I had 10 minutes. So it was just imagine church like this with the aisle down the middle and the doors in the back. So when you open the doors, you were in the church. And so I get up, and I remember what I was preaching, but I started, and as soon as I started, the back doors slammed open, the loudest, boom, and it burst open, and this wind rushed in. And this wind was so powerful. I mean, it's blowing people's, hair. It's blowing. We felt it up on the stage, and we stood there, and two people in the back were struggling, and they closed the doors, and everyone is sitting in stunned silence going, what just happened? But I knew what happened. That was the Holy Spirit wind of God. And so I got fired up. And for the next 8.5 minutes, I preached the most powerful sermon you've ever heard. Hundreds of people came to Christ. There's only 20 people in the room, but hundreds came. And I was so fired up. I was like, man, this is happening. Wow, first sermon right out of the gate. It was grand slam home run out of the. And afterwards, we found out there had just been what's called a microburst, or just a windstorm, kind of. And actually, the wind that blew open the doors was the same wind that knocked the canopy off the front of the church that then crushed our church van that we had driven up there. So our college leader next time, it was like, hey, next time don't be so quick to attribute everything. And I just tell you that story because I thought of it this morning, and I also thought it is hard sometimes to trust what God is doing. And I want to look at that a little bit today. I want to actually show you a photograph. You can see it up here. Shout out to me for a second. What are you seeing in that picture? What do you see? Dumpster? What else? Ball field. The beginning of a church. Beginning of a church? What else, somebody here? Somebody came up to this dumpster or whatever ball field. There's a guy back there. There's a mattress. Somebody had put some graffiti over here. At some point, someone came, and I don't know if it looks like they either scraped away or they sprayed the words "Trust Jesus." And I thought, what do you do when you see those words? You just happen to be walking by. Trust Jesus. We talk about it a lot. I know one thing that's been true of this church here at this location, but of course Vanguard all through its life, is that this church believes that God wants to redeem every part of us. He wants to restore us. And restoration with Jesus is more than just a one-time transaction. It's a way of living. It's an ongoing, never-ending restoring of our souls, our lives, and the world around us. And sometimes we try to capture all that just by saying two words: trust Jesus. But what does that mean? And I know sometimes it's easy for us to become desperate in our need for restoration in so many different areas of our lives. And some of us realize that we need that, and some of us don't. And some of us think that our broken pieces are easy for everyone to see, and then for others, not so much. And some of us find it really easy to say, well, I just trust Jesus for everything. And others of us might laugh at that. Not in a mocking way, but just because the idea that you could just trust Jesus with everything is so ludicrous, and our view is so limited. Some of us are desperate to be healed. Some of us are desperate for something in our life to come back around. And some of us don't have any idea at all what the words trust Jesus really mean. And if you've ever struggled with the phrase trust Jesus, I hope you're going to lean in today to the story of Jesus from the book of Mark. Mark chapter 5. Because in Mark chapter 5 today, we're actually going to see two stories that begin to collide with two people that are both wrestling with what it means for them to trust Jesus. And so I'm going to invite you to turn with me to Mark chapter 5. Now, today I'm going to use a translation. When our church taught through this book, we used a translation by a guy named Dr. Nicholas Zola, who is a professor of New Testament at Lincoln Christian University in Illinois. So you're not going to be able to find that one online, but we're going to put the words up here, and you can follow along as well. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5, 21, and let's dive into the first of these two stories. Mark 5, verse 21. And when Jesus crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered to him. And he was by the sea, and one of the synagogue rulers by the name of Jairus comes. And seeing him, he falls to his feet. And he began begging him urgently, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, place your hands on her so she may be saved and live." Now, if you've heard this story before, or maybe you've never heard this story before, you could probably instantly connect with this father, right? This agonized household, this distraught father, this hope that is starting to slip away. What can we do? We've tried everything. And then they hear that this man, Jesus, this person who's starting to become pretty popular, pretty well known for his healings, he's nearby. And so Jairus is this leader of the local synagogue. He's kind of like Pastor Richie here at Tri-Lakes. He's the leader of the local synagogue. But then Jesus is this other person. He's this traveling rabbi. He's causing a stir. He's starting to say some controversial things. He's starting to get people a little bit confused because they're saying, well, he sounds a little bit different than what we're hearing at our place. Now, Jairus comes to him. Just imagine for a second that Richie and Dana, you found out that their son Justice was really sick. And they had been praying for him. You'd been praying for him every Sunday. And then you find out that Richie had taken Justice down to the mosque down in Colorado Springs and said, I'm going to try the mosque out and see if that's going to work to help heal Justice. Can you imagine for a second that would kind of cause you some confusion? Hey, I'm confused. Why would you go down there? It seems like you're doing something very different than what you've been teaching us. And why would the leader of a synagogue go to a traveling rabbi? That's what's happening here. But Jairus is at a point where he's willing to spend great personal cost to come and kneel before Jesus. And it is amazing how all these things can get set aside when it's your daughter who's sick. Verse 24. And Jesus left with him, and the great crowd followed him and was pressing in upon him. Pressing in upon him. Everyone wanted to get close to Jesus. So there's our story. So we're following a story, we're invested, and then all of a sudden Mark throws us a curveball because it's like he jumps to another scene of something else that's happening at the exact same time. And so we leave Jairus and his daughter in this situation, and all of a sudden Mark says in verse 25, and a woman. Well, now there's a woman. She had a flow of blood for 12 years. And she had endured much under many doctors, and she had spent all that she had, and who did not improve, but rather grew worse. This woman. This woman had a condition that back then they used to call the flux. The flux. It's this abnormal, unending flow of blood, and nothing that she had tried could stop it. And they had tried everything. Now, I know that we live in a world, in a country today where we have access to amazing kinds of medicine. Not so much back then. And it says that, Mark says she didn't just suffer from the disease, but she also suffered from the attempts to cure her. You see, there was a book back then that they used kind of side by side with the Old Testament Torah, what we call the Bible, and it was called the Talmud. The Talmud was a set of Jewish writings that said, well, now here's what you do in different situations. So when this happens, you do this. When this happens, you do this. Well, if you pulled the Talmud off the shelf and you went to the F's and you looked up flux, it had a list of 11 different kinds of cures that you could do for somebody that had flux. So, okay, so you just start going down them. One of the cures, these are real cures. I'm not making any of this up, okay? One of the cures for the flux was they would go find some cow dung and they would they'd dig through it until they found a little piece of grain that hadn't been digested, and they would take it to the patient and they would say, swallow this, and they'd eat it, and then they'd say, arise from your flux. Now, you probably can guess how often that was successful. Not very much. So they had other ones. Then another cure they had was they would take 3 pints of onions and they would boil them in wine. Doesn't this sound good? And then they would give it to the person to drink, and she would drink it, and then they would say, arise from thy flux. If that didn't work, then they had another cure. This is like, okay, if we've tried everything, we're going to try the big cure. Here's the big cure. They would have her sit at the intersection of 2 roads, and she would hold a cup of wine in her right hand, and then someone would come up and sneak up behind her. So she's at 4 roads, and she doesn't know which one. Someone's job was to come up behind her and go, bah! And scare her. And she, wine goes everywhere. And then while she's kind of recovering from that, they would say, arise from thy flux. This is the kind of stuff that she did for 12 years. Just imagine all the friends coming up and saying, well, my cousin one time had the flux, and they tried. Just imagine 12 years of this stuff. And whatever she had tried, it had gotten worse. And now she's spent her money, she's broke, she's anemic from losing all this blood, she's exhausted, and she's desperate. Now, later traditions added to this story a name for this woman, Berenice. And I'm just going to call her that so that she's a person today that we can talk to. But that's not necessarily her real name. But I'm going to call her Berenice. So Berenice, let's keep going, hearing the things about Jesus, came up from behind in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she was saying, Mark's saying she was thinking this, if I touch even his clothes, I'll get saved. Now think for a minute, where in the world would she get the idea that if you touch Jesus' clothes, you would be healed or saved? Did Jesus ever tell people, come touch my clothes? Come unto me and touch my clothes? Here's my shoes, No, he never said, where would she get this kind of crazy idea? Well, back in the Old Testament, God said something to Moses. He told him this. He said, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corner of your garments with a blue cord on each tassel. Now think about this for a second. So imagine there's like this shawl or this robe you might put on, and there's little tassels at the bottom. And these tassels were to represent the words of God, the commands of God. And when people would see like the religious leader walking around with the tassels, like even his clothes would communicate to people, we follow the words of God. They're right here. We follow them. Even to this day, if you were to go visit a synagogue or a temple, you would probably see the rabbi get up, and at some point they'd put on the shawl, or they'd walk out with a shawl that you see that hangs down with little tassels on them. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is, if you go to the very last book of the Bible, in the Old Testament, to the book of Malachi, there was a verse that had a prediction about the coming Messiah that would one day come, and here it was. For you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. So the book of Malachi, so Son of Righteousness is referring to this Messiah that's going to come, but you see the word wings. The word wings is the same word that refers to the edge of a garment where the tassels were attached. You starting to track where it's going? So this legend began to spring up, and the legend was this: hey, when the Messiah comes, there's going to be special healing power in his wings, in the tassels of his prayer shawl. Now, Jesus, as an observant Jew, most likely would have been wearing a shawl like this, a prayer shawl, with tassels at the four corners. Are you connecting all the dots now? So it's very possible that Berenice thinks Jesus might be the Messiah. And she thinks, the legend says, if he's really the Messiah and I touch the corner of his wings, of his tassels, I could get healed. I've tried literally everything else to arise from my flux. Why not give this a shot? Verse 29, this is crazy. It worked. Immediately, her source of blood dried up, and she knew in her body she was cured of the disease. And immediately, Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power went out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his students said to him, well, you see the crowd, right? You see the crowd pressing in on you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?" Everyone's touching you. What are you talking about? And he began looking around to see the one who did this. This is always such a confusing part to me. I don't understand how Jesus knows immediately that power went out. I don't really know what it means that power went out immediately. I'm not sure how it worked that she touched the hem, and was the legend true? I don't know all this stuff. But imagine being Jairus, okay? Now you have come to Jesus. My daughter's dying. She has hours. She has minutes. We got to hurry. We got to go. We got to go. Come on. And Jesus is like, wait, let's stop this whole procession. Who touched me? I could see Jairus going, Jesus, I don't know who touched you, but my daughter's dying. Let's keep going. Jesus says, no, I got to find out who touched me. A friend of mine calls this moment in Jesus' life malpractice. This is malpractice. Now think about it. You have a woman with a chronic condition who's getting attention ahead of a girl who has an acute condition. You have a woman that, well, she's been dealing with this for 12 years, probably going to deal with it for 12 more years, ahead of a person that's like, she's going to die any minute. Jesus says, I'm going to stop and talk to this woman who's just been healed while that other patient is dying. If these two were in the same emergency room, and any doctor who would treat this woman first ahead of this daughter would be sued for malpractice. And Jairus and the disciples have to be thinking, don't you understand? How is Jesus not aware of what's going on? How could he be so clueless? How could he be so forgotten? Does he not remember the whole point of what we're doing today? This little girl needs help now. Hurry. But Jesus will not be hurried. He wants to meet the one who touched him. Mark goes on, verse 33. But the woman, afraid and trembling, knowing what happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, there's probably many reasons why she might be afraid. She might be afraid just because she's gotten called out, or maybe she just was hoping to slip away. But another thing that is at play here is because of the condition she had, this flux, she was what they called ceremonially unclean. Back in this day, it was a big deal whether you were clean or not. And it really didn't have anything to do with if you had taken a shower and put on deodorant and smelled nice. It really was like, are you spiritually clean? Have you broken any of these laws in our Talmud that might say, hey, you can't really come to church. You really can't come to the synagogue. You can't be a part of the fellowship because you're not clean. Maybe you've done something wrong. Maybe you did something you shouldn't have. Maybe you touched something you shouldn't have. Maybe you ate something you shouldn't have. They had all these rules of being clean. Wouldn't it be crazy? Think about a Sunday morning before you came here, you had to sit there and go through a list. Did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do this? Wouldn't it be even crazier if you showed up on a Sunday morning and you had eaten something the night before and Richie came in and he's like, now you're done. You're not here today. Why not? Well, you're not clean. You can't come be part of the community. Just how crazy that was, but that's what their life was like. She was unclean. That meant you can't be a part of people's homes. You can't be a part of people's dinners. You can't be a part of our gatherings and worship. You can't be a part where things are happening. You can't be where the rabbi is. You can't be where the teachings are. For 12 years. But what did she just do that could really have gotten her in trouble? What did she just do with her uncleanness? What did she do? She touched the rabbi. Bad enough that you just showed up, but now you've contaminated him. You've touched him, and you've made him unclean. And he's this guy we're trying to hold up and follow. She was afraid. What would this rabbi say? I mean, he's demanding to see her. Who touched me? Who touched me? And she said, I did. And instead of hearing a rebuke or a punishment or take her away, she hears this. He said to her, daughter, your trust has saved you. Go in peace, shalom, be healed of your disease. You know what I love? There's a lot I love here, but did you know this is the only time that Jesus ever uses the word daughter? This daughter. This woman has been outside all relationships for 12 years, and Jesus says daughter. I wonder why he called her daughter. I really wonder what Jairus thought to hear Jesus call this woman he doesn't even know daughter, while his own daughter is literally dying steps away. Daughter, your trust has made you well. Shalom, peace. According to the rules of the days we've talked about, because she was unclean, she wasn't allowed to be part of the community. She was on the outside. Jesus has not just given her physical healing, he's given her life back. She now has shalom. It's not just shalom like, hey, shalom, see ya. It's actually shalom. You are welcomed back in. She came to Jesus so desperate, nowhere else to turn. She was so tired of hearing, arise from thy flux. But then Jesus goes one step further and he forces her to go public with his belief. This is the other part. Jesus could have easily just looked, okay, someone got healed. All right, I do that all the time. This is no big deal for me. I'm going to keep walking. But he stops and he calls, I want you to say it. I want you to stand up. I want to hear your voice say it. And now she's going to be punished. Maybe she's going to be exiled even further for touching the rabbi. And yet Jesus outs her faith. I want to admit something with you. Maybe you would admit this with me. Sometimes it's a scary thing to express that you really trust Jesus. Sometimes it's hard to express that to coworkers. Sometimes it's hard to express that to someone you've just met. Sometimes it's hard to even own it in your own heart. It takes a huge amount of trust to admit that you trust Jesus, a huge amount of faith, and usually you got to get to a point where you're pretty desperate. You know, when people write Jesus saves or trust Jesus up on like that picture I showed you, sometimes it can feel pretty cliche, pretty churchy. Just like, well, brother, just trust Jesus. Everything will be okay. Just trust Jesus. It'll be okay. I had one of those moments last year. 2021, my mom passed away unexpectedly, very rapidly. And I remember we're in Dallas, Texas. We're outside at the funeral because it was back, you couldn't have a funeral inside. So I'm out there, and the guy's up doing the funeral, and I'm sitting on the front row. Here's my wife. Here's her husband, my stepdad. Here's our kids. Here's the casket. And the guy's up there, and I remember from the sermon that he's talking, and he's talking about how you can't question God. He's like, you got to trust God. You can't question him. Just question, don't question him. You just have to trust him. And I remember, if I'm being really honest with you, I was in the front row going, I got questions. I got some big questions about how this went down, about how this happened and what's going on here. And I don't know, is it really like, is God going to strike me down for saying, whoa, time out in the middle of this sermon, in the middle of this funeral? I have some questions. To be honest, I think God is much bigger and able to handle our questions. I don't think he flies off the handle like that. But I had some questions. And I felt at that funeral, and there's a lot going on with me that day, but I just felt like I was hearing this message of trust Jesus. And I was like, I don't know that I do right now. And yet, trusting Jesus somehow changes for us when we start to get desperate. And at this point in the text, I'm always reminded that, wait a minute, there's another story happening. We've been following this woman, but when we started the show, at the beginning, when we started, we were following Jairus and his daughter, and now we've been following this woman. What's happening over there? So Mark flips back and reminds us that something else was going on. While he is still speaking, so he is saying, daughter, shalom, om, and while that word is still coming out of his mouth, some come from the synagogue's rulers to say, your daughter died. Why bother the teacher any further? Wow. Why trouble the teacher any further? There's a belief here, it seems, that they believed while the child was still sick, Jesus could heal her. Because this is Jesus. So Jesus has this level of power. He can heal sick people. So as long as she's dying and she's still alive and she's sick, okay, Jesus, hurry, 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 hurry. But if you're too late, then it's over because no one has this power, right? Jesus has this power maybe. He didn't have this power. So it's kind of this whole thing is like this giant balloon that just begins to deflate. Hurry, hurry, my daughter's dying. We got to go. What? Never mind. Just don't even bother, Jesus. I don't want to bother you anymore. Sorry that my daughter is a bother to you. But Jesus, disregarding the message being delivered, I wish we had time just to say, what is that? I disregard that. He says to the synagogue ruler, do not be afraid, only trust. Here's that word again. When Jesus looks at Jairus and says, do not be afraid, only trust, I wonder if you can almost see him looking past Jairus' head to each one of us. And he's saying it to us as well. Don't be afraid, only trust. Trust. And even this is one of the reasons why I believe in the power of preaching. Even though we're reading an old story, Jesus is still looking to you where you are right now this morning with the thing that you're carrying, and he's saying, don't be afraid. Trust. Even if you're at that point where you go, I just decided to stop bothering him. I've been asking. He's not doing anything. Time's running out. I'm just not going to bother him anymore. Do not be afraid, only trust. And then they start to walk. Mark picks up the action, verse 37. He didn't allow anyone to follow along with him except Rock. We call him Peter, but I just like the word Rock. Rock and James and John, the brother of James, and they came to the house of the synagogue ruler. Now listen to this. He sees a commotion and those weeping and wailing loudly. And entering, he says to them, why are you making a commotion? Why are you weeping? The child did not die, but is sleeping. And what did everybody do? What did they start doing? They begin to laugh at him. I've always been intrigued by how quickly there's wailing and then there's laughing. There's weeping and then they're laughing. How did they switch gears so fast? And I dug into this a little bit. This is really interesting. Back in this culture, they had professional mourners. You could get hired to go to a funeral and cry. Why would they do that? Well, they would come in, so they'd have, imagine we're having a funeral right now, and we're all here, we're sad, but we're kind of in a culture where we don't want to be really sad, we don't want to be weeping, we don't want to be, we kind of want to be a little proper. Well, we don't want to be embarrassed. And so they would have people that would come in and they'd be like, and they'd be crying and wailing. And just imagine the really good mourners might get a little extra tip at the end. They're really good at it. They're crying. What they're doing is they're crying so loudly that no one's noticing that you got a tear running down your cheek. No one's realizing that you just can't hold it together. I thought about coming up with slogans for what, they die, we cry, stuff like that. They gone, we moan. I couldn't, I decided not to because I didn't think it'd be funny. But these guys were professional mourners. Sometimes I kind of wish we still had those people. I kind of wish, I was just being honest again, I kind of wish at my mom's funeral there were some professional mourners going, because then I would have been like, yeah, I'm mad too. But I had to sit there in my suit, just be somber. And this may explain this quick switch from wailing to laughing, because you think about it, these customs have become so artificial. Some of these people, maybe they've been to 100 funerals in their life. Yeah, we go in, they do this, they say a bunch of stuff, we cry, and then there's snacks afterwards. Like, they just know the rhythm. But this time, Jesus walks in and goes, oh, she's not dead, she's asleep. And they just broke character. I'm going to lose my tip on this, but this is funny. She's still alive. But Jesus, driving everyone out, takes the child's father and mother and those with him and goes into where the child was, and taking the child's hand, the little 12-year-old girl, he takes her hand and he says to her, Talitha koum, which is translated, girl, I say to you, rise. Now, you may know that the New Testament's written in a language called Greek. It's not written in English. We read it in English because it'd be too hard to read the other way. But it's written in Greek. However, there are a few occasions where another language, Aramaic, is spoken. And a lot of us think that Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, and then the people that are writing Greek would just translate that down and write it into Greek, and that's what we have today. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, and for some reason, Mark decided, instead of translating this, I just really want to say what he said. I want to write down exactly what he said because it meant something. But I know you're not going to know what that means, so I'll say what he said, and then I'll tell you what he said. So he says what he said, Talitha koum, and he tells us what he said. Girl, I say to you, rise. And it's interesting. Jesus is saying to this girl what her parents probably said to her every morning for 11 years, 11 months, 30 days. Talitha koum, it's time to get up. Talitha koum, we're going to go eat. We're going to go outside today. We're going to go to the fields. Talitha koum. Jesus says, Talitha koum. But when Jesus says, Talitha koum, immediately, the girl rose up and began walking around. She was 12 years old. She got up, started walking. Why does Mark have to remind us? He's the one putting these stories together. So let me make the connection I can see. For 12 years, this girl had lived and died and now was alive again. For 12 years, this woman had suffered internal bleeding, and she was dead to the community, but now she was alive again. And immediately, the crowd, the people standing in this room, mom, dad, the disciples, they were exceedingly astonished, and he ordered them explicitly that no one should know this, and he said, give her something to eat. She's hungry. It's tired being dead. It makes you hungry. Give her something to eat. The mom went and got some chicken soup and gave it to him. He turns to leave, pushes his way through the crowd, lowers his voice, and says, don't tell anybody. Story ends. What do we take away from this today? Jairus had come to Jesus for a cure, but he got much more than he asked for. He got a resurrection. Berenice had come to Jesus for a healing in secret, but she got much more than she imagined. She got her faith publicly commended, and she got her life restored. There's a guy I like named Tim Keller, and I think he captures the point of this better than I could, so I want to read what he said. He says this: when you go to Jesus for help, you get from him far more than you had in mind, and you also end up giving to him far more than you expected to give. When you come to Jesus for help, you're going to get far more from him than you had in mind, but you're also going to end up giving to him far more than you expected to give. Jairus came thinking, I'm going to trust Jesus just enough to get him to my house before my daughter dies. But Jesus says, I'm going to ask much more from you. After Jairus' daughter had died, in the midst of apparent malpractice by this so-called Messiah, Jesus looks him right in the eyes and says, I need you to trust me. You trusted me just this much, but I'm going to say, I want you to trust me this much. Berenice hoped to trust Jesus just enough that if I just touch his garment, no one has to know, but Jesus demanded far more from her. He said, you trust me this much? I'm going to ask you to trust me this much, because I'm going to call you out in front of this crowd and risk you potentially having horrible things happen to you or fear, and I'm going to call your faith out, and you're going to have to trust me more than you intended. This leads me to this. Maybe both of these people had limited views of Jesus Christ. Jesus is a guy who can heal, nothing more. Jesus is a guy who can heal, nothing more. And both of them, because of their desperation, had their views of Jesus enlarged. And so what it leads me to is wonder this. Maybe we need to be in a place of desperation for our view of Jesus to enlarge, for us to really trust Jesus. Maybe those words take on new power when we've gone through something where we get desperate. Because how often do we put our faith in something that requires us to say, arise from thy flux, arise from thy flux? It's funny, I was thinking, what would it take to get to a point where you would say, okay, eating a piece of grain out of a piece of cow dung, I'm going to try it. How desperate would you have to be? And then I realized why I would do that. Because at least I'm doing something. And I am a control freak. And I'll be honest with you, like going and going, well, you know, Jesus, God's not doing anything. I'm going to go try something as dumb and ludicrous as it sounds, because at least I'm doing something instead of trusting Jesus. Mark doesn't tell us these stories to promise. Here's the point as I close. Mark is not telling us these stories to promise that Jesus is always going to heal the child who dies or the woman who suffers. That would be the wrong takeaway here. In fact, the very next chapter, we find out a story of what happens to one of Jesus' most faithful followers who gets his head cut off. So there's no way that you could take away and say Jesus always does this. Well, then why is Mark telling us these two stories? G. Campbell Morgan was one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century. And his first daughter, Gwenny, when she was 5 years old, she died unexpectedly. No one saw it coming. Just boom, it happened. 5 years old. He carried this loss with him every day of his life. He thought about it. It hurt him. He lost his kid. 40 years later, he was preaching on this same passage. And I wanted to read you what he wrote. 40 years later, after his daughter died. He said, I can hardly speak of this matter without becoming personal and reminiscent, remembering a time 40 years ago when my own first lassie lay at the point of death dying. I called out for him then, and he came, and he said to our hearts, fear not, believe only. He did not say, she shall be made whole. She was not made whole in the earthly plane. She passed away into the life beyond. But he did say to her, Talitha koum, that is, little lamb, arise. But in her case, it did not mean stay on the earth level. It means he needed her, and he took her to be with himself. She has been with him all these years as we measure time here, and I have missed her every day. But his word, believe only, has been the strength of all the passing years. I want you to sit with this. When we fall at the feet of Jesus, we receive more than we thought, but we're going to give more than we expected. And Mark tells us these stories to offer us strength to believe, strength to trust, and not be afraid. So I want you to consider this today. What is keeping you from reaching out and touching his hem? Where in your life are you at a point where you're saying, I'm ready to say, I'm done, don't bother? And where do you need to fall at his feet and trust Jesus? Will you pray with me? As you're thinking about this idea of trust, I wonder today, those questions I asked, where you actually are. Is there some place in your life where you're seeing such a level of desperation that you're saying, I want to trust Jesus with this? And maybe even an hour ago, you were ready to give up. But if there's something, I would like to pray for you. And if there's something in your life where you say, I would like to trust Jesus with this today, would you just raise your hand and say, pray for me, I want to do that? Anyone? Okay. Okay. Jesus, I invite you to do what only you can do, which is to look into our hearts, to look us in the eyes and say, do not be afraid, only believe. For those of us in this room that are facing a situation of desperation in our life, in our kids' lives, in our relationships, in our health, with our job, we're saying to you, I want to trust you. And Lord, our trust may be like Berenice or Jairus, where it only goes so far, and you're actually asking us to trust you at a new level. And so I pray your gift of faith and trust upon the people in this room, myself included, especially that point of desperation. You will not be hurried, but we need help. And so we ask you to fill us with faith. Help us to be people who believe and trust. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
We hope that today's message truly encouraged you to fight for a real relationship with Jesus Christ. We want to hear from you. Please send an email to tlpod@vanguardchurch.org. We'd love to know how we can pray for you and hear your stories about how this podcast has impacted your life. If you'd like to give financially to our ministry, just text the amount you'd like to give to the number 84321. You can find Vanguard Tri-Lakes on all social media platforms, and we hope that you'll give us a follow. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you beyond imagination.